Alrighty, good evening everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for Myths and Facts about Early Bilingual Development. Tonight's program will be recorded and I will be sending out links to the video later this week. And without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Adriana Weisleder, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Northwestern University, where she directs the Child Language Lab. Her research investigates early language development in young children growing up in a range of socio-cultural backgrounds, with a focus on dual language learners. She uses multiple methodologies to investigate both the learning mechanisms and contexts that support language development in infants and toddlers. An important goal of this work is to contribute to building a more robust evidence base for understanding typical and atypical language development across diverse contexts, and to reduce inequities in the identification and treatment of child language and communication disorders. Dr. Weisleder is a proud Costa Rican and Spanish-English bilingual. Welcome.
Thank you, Leanne, and hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to share with you. Let me share my screen and make sure that everyone can see everything, and then we can get started. Okay. Can you see okay? And can you hear me okay? Hopefully, yes. Okay. All right. So as Leanne said, my name is Adriana. I have a PhD in developmental psychology, and I mostly study how children learn language. And as a bilingual myself, my first language is Spanish. I'm very interested in language development, especially in children who are learning more than one language. And so what and I also right now have a 3-month-old baby. And so I'm also thinking about this as a parent now myself, who wants my child to be bilingual and to learn my native language. And I know that can feel sometimes like a challenge. And so I'm happy to talk about all of those things. So so I'll be talking about myths and facts about early bilingual development, or what does the science say? I can hear a little bit of okay, now I can't hear. Okay, so I would like to keep this casual and to hear questions from you, but this is my plan, is to talk a little bit about generally multilingualism, some lessons about language development from research, and then talk about some common questions from parents, myths and evidence, and then spend some time on the questions that you might have. So, multilingualism is just a fact of life. The majority of the world's population actually understands and speaks 2 or more languages. Sometimes the way that we talk about multilingualism, it feels like it's a strange thing, or it's the thing that, we ask questions like, are children confused, or, is it a problem? And I like to sort of to reframe that and to say that actually in many parts of the world, this is just a fact of life, and it's the norm, and it's what the majority does. And so we kind of have to reframe our thinking sometimes about that a little bit. So the fact that this happens in the majority of the world means children can learn 2 languages just fine. But learning language is complex, and it depends a lot on the support from families, from educators, and from communities. And so really the questions that we need to ask aren't, can children learn 2 languages? Because we know they can, but what is it that's needed from, the community and from families? And, what more can we ask maybe from our, policies in this country as well to help to support that? So maybe just a little bit for fun. I know that a lot of people in here speak languages other than English. So if you feel like it, maybe you can put in the chat some of the languages that you speak, just to sort of have an idea and get a sense of all the different languages that people here speak. So you can put it in the chat. I'll keep going, but I will take a look, and I'm interested in that. Please stop me anytime if you have a question or want me to make something more clear. Great, so Korean, Chinese, Japanese. Great, that's so great to see these different languages represented. So in the United States, one of the words that gets used sometimes for bilingual children, you may have heard, is dual language learners. Dual language learners are children that come from homes where a language other than English is spoken, and who are in the process of learning their home and the societal language, English. So that's why we call them dual language learners. What are other words that you have heard that describe these children? Are there other words that you know of that get used sometimes instead of dual language learners? Maybe from school or from other places? Are there other terms you have heard? Intense. So something yes, exactly. ELL, I think is what you mean, right? ELLs. So often in schools, they call them ELLs, or English language learners. And you know, I like to say dual language learners because English language learners implies that the only thing we care about is whether or not these children are learning English. But, you know, a lot of times we also care about whether they're continuing to learn their home language. And so, you know, dual language learner recognizes that these kids are learning two languages, not just that they're, you know, sometimes we sort of talk about it as though they're behind in English, but, you know, we're not seeing that they're also learning a whole other language. So, you know, it's something to think about in terms of our terminology. Okay, so I'm going to put up here some of the questions that I often get from parents or, you know, people that I talk to. So I get this question a lot. Does learning two languages cause language delays? Will knowing another language make it more difficult for my child to the chat if you have any of these questions. And these are questions that, okay, there's one hand at least, Lee. A few, okay, here's a couple of hands, a few other hands. Okay, great. So I'm glad to hear that these are questions that you also have. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit and I'm going to sort of go over some of these, but I want to say I'm open to spending more time on the questions that you have. So, you know, please, you know, as I talk about this, you know, stop me and, you know, put in the chat or tell me what are the questions you're most interested in, and I'll focus on those. Okay. But I want to start just by talking a little bit generally about early language development and what we know, because that's really the basis for what I'm going to talk about in terms of bilingual language development, right? So language development, one thing that's important to know is that it is a social process and it depends on exposure. So it depends on the language kids hear in their environment, the amount, or what we say, the quantity of language. And sometimes we say the quality. I don't love that word, but meaning, you know, really kind of how meaningful that language is for the children who are learning, which languages are used, and the age of exposure. And one thing, you know, this is some of my own work that has shown, is that child-directed language that we use with, you know, our children, leads children to have bigger vocabularies and faster language processing. So one of the kind of important things in talking about bilingualism is that it's not just about what, you know, what is the child capable of, or sort of what's going on in their brains or how they learn, but it's a lot about the support that they have from the environment, and not just parents, but also, the community. Now, one of the reasons that early language development matters, speaking here at the library, is that it is the foundation for literacy development as well, right? So I think a lot of you might care about that, not just sort of children learning language, but also that helping them to learn to read and to become literate and do well in school. So as a brief review, here are the things that help children learn language. It's, how much language they hear, the different kinds, the sort of diversity of talk and language that they hear, something that we call responsiveness, and then literacy and learning activities. So I'll go through these kind of quickly. So the first one is maybe a little bit, I don't know, maybe this is obvious to you, maybe not, but children who hear more language just have more opportunities to learn, right? So they have bigger vocabularies and they're faster, they're sort of better, their ears get tuned to processing language or their brains, because they could also be learning sign language. So really not their ears, but their brains kind of get tuned to processing the languages around them. So kids who hear more language have more opportunities to learn. And one thing that is good to know is that children's brains are really, really what we call plastic or malleable. They are adaptable. They adapt to the environments that they're in. For us as adults, learning a second language can be very difficult, but it's just not the same for young children. They are kind of, they come into the world, really sort of built to learn language, and they can adapt to the environments that they're in. So we have to separate kind of what it feels like to us as adults to learn a second language with what it's like for a child whose brain is kind of adapting to the environment that they're in. And so if they're hearing a lot of language and it's two languages, their brains are adapting to that, okay? So one thing that helps them is just to learn, to be exposed to a lot of language. Another thing that helps them is the diversity of the language that they hear, right? So if we think about vocabulary, children learning different words, well, they are learning the words that they hear. And so if they hear, words about many different topics, that are related to each other, their vocabulary is growing with all of those different words that they're hearing, right? If they hear a lot about the same things, then they're only learning about those few things. So sometimes we think we have to keep things, really, really simple for our kids, but really, they do benefit from hearing lots of different words and hearing about lots of different things as well. Obviously, still to their level. And this is one thing that books, and I'll get to that, are really good for, right? When I have a 3-month-old baby, and I try to kind of have conversations with her sometimes. Of course, she's, not talking, she's making sounds. And, it can be a little hard to sort of think about different things to say to her that expose her to lots of different words. But children's books are really good in that they tell stories, they use different words than the ones that we often use in conversation. And so that's helping to build that sort of vocabulary for young kids. Okay, something really important is this idea of responsive language. So yes, even if they are in different languages, Duane. So do you mean, I'll get to this a little bit more, but tell me a little more about your question.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if the child is exposed to a lot of words, like does it matter that they're in different languages? So like sometimes his grandparents are around and they're talking, yes, it's a baby, it's a baby. They're talking in different languages. Does that also help?
Yes, it absolutely helps. And I'll talk a little bit more about the languages and vocabularies in just a second. But there's two ways in which it helps. So one is kids are learning a lot about the sounds of language. So when they're really little, just hearing language, one of the things that kids have to do is learn about sort of the sounds of different languages. And so I don't know if you all have this experience, but sometimes when we hear another language, we can kind of, there's some sounds in that language that, we can't produce once we're older, but we also sometimes can't even hear the difference in sounds in other language. And that's one of the things that in like just the first year of life, kids' brains are specializing to the sounds of the languages in their environment. And so if they're exposed to, another language from the grandparents, those sounds that they're hearing, that will keep them able to recognize those sounds in another language. And so that's really, really useful and important, actually. So yeah.
And does that matter how long the child has to be exposed? Like if it was 2 weeks versus 3 months or something, like, does it matter? Or and the frequency, like, because grandparents don't come over that often.
That often, yes, I hear you. So yeah, that is a good question. So unfortunately, we don't. So kind of what we know is that a little bit of sort of like more is better, right? So like more exposure is sort of better. But of course, it's not like you need to hear this like constantly. So we don't know that specifically sort of how much, but I can tell you that, for example, there is one study that exposed kids to another language 1 hour every week for 8 weeks. And that was enough to keep them recognizing those sounds. So, in some ways that's just 8 hours, but it's also, it's sort of being repeated every week. So it's kind of hard to know if like just having it all 1 week and then not hearing that language for a very long time will be just as good. But I would say, that everyone has different circumstances. So if that's what's possible, then I think that still is some help. But it is important to sort of try to maintain and to sort of try to sustain that exposure in some way with at least some regularity. Because if not at some point, then once there's no more exposure, that starts to fade. Okay, so, this idea of responsive language is that children learn words for things and events that interest them. So this is something you may kind of know from your own kids. It's kind of, especially with young kids, it's hard to get them to pay attention to things that they don't want. And it's the same with language. They learn best from language that is related to their own actions, both in time and in meaning. So I'm going to give you a more concrete example. So the baby's looking at the ball and you say, yeah, it's a ball. Do you like the ball? It's a pretty simple thing, but they're very likely to learn that word ball because that's what they're interested in that moment. They're looking at it. You're talking about something that they are focused on. So they're probably they're very receptive to learning that word. If the kid is looking at the ball and you're talking about the bench that's behind, or, you're saying, don't play with that, play with this. That's less helpful, right? Because their attention is on this object and we're talking about something else. So for the most part, we want to try to sort of follow their attention and kind of what they're, interested in and looking at and label and sort of talk about those things. And that's what's going to be most helpful for learning language. Okay, and then the last thing is these literacy activities. So book sharing, which is something, if you're at this event at the library, probably, something you've heard about before, but also oral storytelling and play are examples of activities that support children's language and their emergent literacy. And that's partly because of what I was saying before, the children hear more words and a greater variety of words during book sharing than during other routines, right? So it's, good to talk to your kids in all kinds of ways. We all need to, tell our kids to put on their clothes and to behave and to, do all these things that we use language for. But when we do these kinds of, literacy and learning activities, we're using usually kind of more complex language and more diverse language that can be especially helpful for building a very, a larger vocabulary and some of those emergent literacy skills. Okay, so just to, yes, please.
So I have a 10-month-old, and like specifically this point in time, he's very much interested in books that have like, like a ball, single object and just one, just says ball, as opposed to like a little more complicated, a slightly more complex books.
Yeah.
And I always wonder if I should try to read books that are like more storytelling or, more complex, or just stick to the books that he's really interested in, because it's like very black and white photos of like a duck or, a bird or a dog or something, and he knows what they are and he likes to point to it and, say one word at a time. Okay, I'll mute myself.
No, that was great. Great question. I love it. So yeah, so I would say, right, so they're kind of serving different purposes, those two types of books, right? So the first one is the one that he likes is really great for like this kind of thing, right? Like you said, like he likes the pictures, he's pointing at them, he's focused on them. And so that's great. That's like you're playing with that book, and that's wonderful. And that's probably, he's learning a lot from that. And also it's just, you want to do something that they're having fun with. You don't need to start reading more complex books until, it seems like, he's a little more interested. But sometimes, what I kind of do is, I read some of those more complex books, just like as, kid is like kind of falling asleep or as part of a routine, not so much because they're going to understand it, but just to sort of start just kind of getting used to sort of that routine, and maybe start exposing them to some new words, at least the sounds of some of those words, for when they're a little bit older, when they'll be able to understand. But I would say, there's no pressure to kind of start reading those more complex books until you feel like your child is ready for them. The like simple picture book is great for a 10-month-old. But sometimes also, well, I don't know, for me, sometimes it's just also kind of, sometimes it's fun for me to read those kinds of like stories, and I know that they're not understanding everything, but I know that like that slowly they're sort of being exposed, and later we'll understand. Yeah, sorry, you raised your hand again.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, Joanne, sorry. Yes, yeah.
So what about songs? Like yes, baby. What about songs? Is that a good way to learn, like to expose the baby to more languages? And the difference between like maybe more adult song versus children's song? Is it better to sing more children's song, or like just more general exposure of songs we listen to ourselves?
I think songs are great. And, there's no, if your child likes adult songs, or it's whatever, they like and you like. So I don't think there's any reason why you have to sing children's songs, although some of those, have, they're just kind of, they're done so that kids especially like them. And one thing I will say is kids love, and it's good for them, is repetition. So you probably kind of like all know this, right? Especially young kids, they like repetition. That same goes for the book. They like repetition, and it's actually really useful. So for them, repetition is a really good way to learn. And so one of the things that those children's songs have is they have kind of like this repetition. Sometimes they have a structure that repeats, and that can be helpful. Same with kids' books. But of course, also adult music is just fine if they like it. Yeah. Okay, so just to kind of recap a little bit here. So, language acquisition depends on exposure, amount, diversity, responsiveness, and literacy activities are the 4 that I kind of focused on. Language is a social process founded on social interactions. This is going to be important when we talk a little more about TV and media. And then more child-directed language leads to improved or sort of just bigger vocabulary and faster language processing. And, kind of what I like to say is earlier is better, but it's never too late. So kids can learn languages well into adolescence, and also in adulthood. Younger is easier, but, if you have preschool kids or school age kids, they can still learn. Okay, so Now, what about bilingual language development, which is what I kind of came to talk about. So the reason I wanted to do this recap is that bilingual language development is just the same. It's just not that different. All the principles that we know from monolingual language development are also true of bilingual language development. It's just that we have to think about a few other things, like the age of exposure matters, the amount of each language that they hear matters, and the literacy activities in each of the languages matters, right? So all of these principles are still true, but it's just that, everything is kind of, we have to think about these two languages. Okay, so let's get into the myths and common questions. I'll start with some, and again, you can tell me which ones you want to talk more about. So let's do a kind of true or false. Put in the chat what you think. Don't worry, there's no kind of right or wrong answer at this moment. I'll explain. So learning two languages causes language delays. What do you think? Okay, so I see one false. Tentatively true. Okay. This is speaking true. Okay, so there's a mix. Okay, so this one will be interesting to talk about. So here's why I think there's such varied opinions on this. It's because this word, delay, is a confusing word. Oops, sorry, I did something weird there, but the word delay is something that we use a lot, but it's not actually very clear what we mean by it. And so this myth can be answered differently because people are thinking of different things. So let me tell you what I think we know and see if this helps. Well, let's start with this. So exposure to two languages doesn't cause a general language delay, like an overall language delay, okay? The human brain is able to learn 2 or 3 or more languages without any problem. So the question I then get is, why does it often seem like bilingual children are behind their monolingual peers? So here's the toy example that I say. Let's say there's this girl, Elizabeth, and she knows 200 words in English, okay? And then there is Lupe, who only knows 100 words in English, okay? But Lupe also knows 100 words in Spanish. So in total, Lupe knows 200 words and Elizabeth knows 200 words. Seems like on that they're the same. And so now the question is, would you say that Lupe has a language delay? No. One person said no. What do others think? Yes. Okay. No, but the school might. Right. Exactly. Great. So there's a little bit of ambiguity, right? Because the word delay, it depends on what we're focusing on. So if we are focused, if the school is only in English and they only care about English, then, they will look at this and say that Lupe is delayed, right? Because she knows fewer words in English than the monolingual kids in the class. And that's what's viewed as the standard oftentimes. But they're missing this whole other picture about Lupe, which is that she knows, a lot of other words in another language. And so this is the thing that is, this is why this kind of question about bilingual kids can be tricky, because we often compare bilingual kids to a standard, which is English-speaking monolingual kids, that isn't reflective of all of their linguistic knowledge and all of their linguistic abilities. And early on, this is very obvious. Now, as kids get older, this difference, right? So bilingual kids initially, so let me show you some, okay, so that is a good question. And let me show you some actual data on this. Oh, maybe I didn't put it in here. Okay. Okay. I don't know why I don't have this slide, but I'll describe it. So what the data show is that when you consider a bilingual child, this is in a study of children who are from 1 to 3 years of age. Okay, so they are young kids. And that is where we see the biggest differences in terms of bilingual development, because later on, these things bilingual and monolingual kids get closer together over time. So what happens is really what you see here. So if you look at just if you compare bilingual and monolingual kids on just one of their languages, bilingual kids look delayed early on. Okay, early on, they look delayed. When you combine their languages, there is no evidence of delay. Even the question that you're asking, so the age at which they produce their first words, if you ask, it can happen with some kids, but on average, right, which is kind of all that the research can tell us, individual kids are different stories, and every kid is their own case, and that's something, so every experience can be a little different, but on average, bilingual kids start to produce, when you ask parents whether their kids started to produce their words in either language, they start to produce words around the same time as monolingual kids. They start combining words around the same time as monolingual kids, and their combined vocabulary across both of their languages is very similar to that of monolingual kids, if they are the same in other characteristics. But it is true that if you look at only one of their languages, then they look delayed. Now, one of the other things that's important to say is that although if you look at only this is for kids who have been exposed to 2 languages almost from birth, like from when they're very young, then as they get older, already by the time that they are, sort of 3, 4, 5, they start to look more similar to monolinguals, even in just one language, in a lot of measures. But the one measure that never kind of looks the same is vocabulary. So even me, I say I'm, very old. I won't tell you my age. I'm old. I'm bilingual, and I still sometimes have trouble. I like forget words in English, or I want to say them in Spanish, and probably you all have had that experience. So in vocabulary, sometimes being bilingual, even when you are perfectly, I think, I'm perfectly capable of communicating in English. I'm doing this presentation, but I still sometimes have trouble with some words. And so that's just something to accept for us as bilinguals. I will take that trade-off, right? I love that I have this whole other language that I can communicate in, but sometimes what that means is that there's a few words in English that I won't know. But on almost every other measure that is in vocabulary, by the time kids hit like sort of elementary school and sort of middle, they look very similar to monolingual kids. Okay, I will pause here because I'm sure there's some questions, but this is kind of the take-home message is that human brains are able to learn 2 languages. Dual language learners are not more likely to have language delays or impairments when we're talking about like, a clinical language impairment, like a general impairment. But learning 2 languages does take a little longer than learning 1. And so bilingual kids are not confused, they're not impaired, but they're learning more, and they may need a little more time to master both of their languages. Does this make sense to people? Does this resonate? Is this helpful? Do you have questions? No, this is a big one.
I have an opposite. I have an opposite question too.
Yeah.
That's a tractor. Does exposure to multiple languages help them be smarter?
Help be smarter. Yes. Okay. I'm gonna get to that question because that's a good one. Yes. So I will talk about that one. Okay. So let's should I move on to the next question, or did someone have one about this still? If you have questions, or please.
I have a question, not on this. This is very clear to me. But something similar to something that somebody else asked earlier about, intermittent exposure to language through grandparents.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, if we have a care provider during the day who speaks non-English language,
Yeah.
and clearly he's being exposed to it daily. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering if down the line, I need to invest in, like when he goes to daycare or something like that, I need to invest in him to get constant exposure so he doesn't like lose it after having gotten, steady exposure to it early in life.
Yes. All right. So this is a good question. And yeah, since have been asked before, let me just, I don't have a slide, but I can talk about it. So this is one where I have kind of a little bit of bad news, which is that yes, kids can kind of lose a lane. I'll be more specific in a second, but they can kind of lose a language if they don't continue to have exposure. So this is like a very unfortunate thing. We think of our native languages as like, you learned it as when you were young, it's your native language, and now you have an advantage in it. And that is true. Being exposed to a language early in life does give you an advantage in learning it. Absolutely. Like I was saying, especially in terms of sounds, your pronunciation, your ability to like hear differences in sounds. But over time, if kids don't continue to be exposed and to practice the language, they lose proficiency in it.
I want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can anyone hear me? I have a question. I am a bilingual German-English speaker. This conversation is just fascinating, and I grew up hearing German before English. But I would say that as a teacher of language, that growing up bilingual reduces the second language interference or first language interference when learning another language. For instance, when I teach German to monolinguals, oftentimes there is considerable language, first language interference, but with bilinguals, I found that to be less the case.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think you're talking about something that there is some evidence of this, that people who are bilingual, when they are learning a third language, right, there is some advantage, some facilitation, and there is some evidence for that, and that's really interesting. So that's cool that you have that experience as a teacher.
Yeah,
did I understand correctly?
I'm sorry. Well, I've studied a number of languages, but I just want to chime in with that observation. Sorry to interrupt.
You're fluent in both languages, and German is just as good as your English.
My German is naturally, from childhood, as fluent as my English. But again, I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to chime in with some observations.
No, great. That's no. I appreciate it. All observations are appreciated. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
But yeah, so, just kind of returning to that question, it doesn't mean, so there's, what I was saying is that there is some evidence that, for example, your child is exposed to, let's just say in my case, Spanish, early on, and then isn't really exposed or doesn't really practice it for many years, and then you try to learn it again later, that there is some facilitation of having been exposed to the language early on, but it isn't the case that you just maintain that level throughout. There is a little bit of a you kind of have to use it and continue to use it to maintain it. So there's a whole field of what's called home language maintenance or heritage language maintenance. And there's now actually at universities, there's programs that teach another language to what are called heritage speakers. So heritage speakers are kids who were, who grew up, who were exposed in homes, their kind of native language was a language other than English, but then they just didn't use it throughout their school years. And by the time, let's say they get to college, they almost don't, know it at all, but they have a little bit of knowledge. And so there's classes for those heritage speakers. So did that answer your question?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's good to know that it's not just, it's not just something
Yeah.
he just for free, he will just hold on to just because he was exposed to. And yeah, it's something really to think about consciously, because in this country, there's you hear English most places, and there's not too many opportunities to speak practice other languages, other than you really try and find classes and things like that. So you have to really go out of your way to try to practice different languages.
That's right.
I hear you. That's exactly right. And one of the, sort of things that I kind of always end on, which is that, it really is important to have community to maintain a language. Kids are, one of the principles I said at the beginning, right? They kind of learn the things that they're interested in. And when it comes to language, they are very savvy and very smart, and they understand that, you use language to communicate. And if they don't have people to use, to communicate with, that they want to communicate with in that language, then they slowly start to not use it. And it's something that we see a lot. We see a lot in my research of kids who, started out like just speaking Spanish, that's their native language. And by age 6 or 7, their parents say, they don't want to talk to me in Spanish anymore. They don't use it. They're in school and all they hear is English, and all the kids speak English, and they kind of stop using it. And over time, that turns to kind of what we call language loss. So I completely agree with you. It's very discouraging sometimes that there are not more spaces in this country to practice those other languages, but I just want to sort of leave you with like encouraging you all to kind of try to form, groups and communities and anything that's possible, so that kids can continue to be exposed and to practice, because it will, pay off, but it is hard sometimes to on your own to do that.
Sorry.
This is where Europeans have more of an advantage, because English is so widespread in many countries, like Germany, for example, that many Americans, first language speakers, when they visit Germany, for example, or Austria, they are kind of impressed by what they feel is the complete fluency of other language speakers when they speak English. Sometimes it can be discouraging for them to have language.
Yeah.
That's all I want.
Agreed.
So now I don't want to hijack the conversation. Just one more question I thought of is I don't like to expose my child to too much screen time or at all for a long time, but I know that videos, video content is something that you can easily turn on and give them exposure to different languages. If you can at some point during during this presentation talk about role of media in language learning.
Yes, I will. And actually, maybe I can just go to that. We don't need to do this. So I think this maybe we kind of covered already. Will knowing another language make it harder for my child to learn English? The answer is no. But one of the things I'll just leave you with is that having strong skills in the home language can support acquisition and growth in a second language like English. So, so there is some amount, it's not perfect, but there is some amount of what we call transfer, which means, you learn some things in your home language and then you're learning English. There are some things that you can transfer. You still have to learn the words, in English. You still have to learn the grammatical structure, right? There's a lot of things kids still have to learn. But for example, if you learned, in your home language that cow and horse are both domestic animals, that conceptual knowledge transfers. And so the stronger of a home language you have, the more, sort of that also supports growth in a second language. So I wanted to kind of make that point. Okay. Before talking about media, let's see, this one is sometimes a controversial one. So what do you think about children mixing languages? Do you think that this is a sign that they're confused? Do you know what I mean by mixing? Like they say a sentence with like words from one language and the other. What do you think about that?
Do you mean when you say mixing languages like the proverbial Spanglish, where they speak English and then they use Spanish, or they speak English and they use Spanish structures?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, so a few people said not confused, and maybe that's because you have experience doing this yourselves, right? They'll grow out of it, right? So it's not a sign of confusion, right? They're not confused. It can be a sign, like I was saying, for me too sometimes, that they don't know the words in the other language, right? So like they're kind of like, they're being, what I say is they're being resourceful, right? They're trying to communicate. It's like helping them in communication. And they just don't know the word in the other language, and so they're kind of mixing. But there's a couple of things that are useful to know. One is that language mixing is grammatical. So it follows the structure as you know, as you were saying, the person who kind of jumped in. There's a structure. So, you know, in Spanish, the verb goes before the noun. And you know, this is how, if the verb is in Spanish, then that means the child is kind of following the grammatical structure in Spanish and will mix in, like, let's say milk, if they don't know the word leche in Spanish. But so it kind of follows the grammar of the language. And so that's something to be, you know, to sort of be paying attention to if you're kind of a little worried about your child's language development is, are they, yes, they're mixing, but are they kind of maintaining the grammatical structure? Because that's an important sign that, you know, they're sort of learning appropriately. And the other thing is that kids are also smart in that they will do more code switching or language mixing with other people who do that, right? Who sort of they know will understand, than with people who like only speak in English, for example. So they're kind of smart enough to sort of also know that in some contexts they can do this more than others. Okay. I guess this question, should I speak in English to my child? Let's see, what do you think? If you speak another language, right? That's a sort of the question.
When I was growing up, my housekeeper, who was German, spoke exclusively in German to me, and those were the first sounds I heard for basic words such as numbers and simple everyday objects. After the age of 6, my parents preferred that I learn only English so that I could communicate with my peers effectively in school, where I grew up in New York.
In the German neighborhood of Upper Manhattan, Yorkville. That's where he grew up, speaking German.
Right. So I think everyone kind of said, you know, so you have, you know, that you don't do it, right? Because you're trying to do one parent, one language, or you're really trying to just give your child exposure to your home language. And that's a very good strategy. My answer to this is always, it depends, which is a little bit of a, you know, kind of trick question, I guess, because it really depends on your circumstances. So the best is to speak to your child in whichever language or languages you feel more comfortable in, right? That's really, when we speak in a language we feel comfortable in, we use more diverse, more complex language, and it's most helpful for language learning. The question about, so because someone brought up one parent, one language, that's also often a question. And if that's kind of the most, the you know, sort of the best strategy for teaching kids. And again, this really depends on the circumstances of your family. So, you know, one of the principles is the more you can expose your child to a language, the better, right? So amount matters. So one parent, one language can often be a good way to make sure that your child is hearing a lot of your home language from, you know, one person. If both of you as parents, you know, speak a home language and want to to expose them to a language and you want to just speak that other language and give that full immersion experience, that can also work. And for parents who are bilingual and use both languages, it will not confuse your child if you yourself use two languages. I actually do this, I try to speak to my child in Spanish, but I speak to my husband in English. And so, sometimes I use both. It's not going to confuse her. Kids are good at keeping those languages separate. But I just have to be mindful to sort of make sure that I'm giving enough exposure of the home language that I want. Okay, so since we have 10 minutes and I want to get to your question. So you asked me about media and does it make kids smarter? And then I see a question in the chat. So let's go to does bilingual make children smarter? So this is a question that is, I like it because it's kind of like it used to a lot of people used to focus on all the disadvantages of bilingualism and how it can cause delays and be a problem. And then we kind of flipped it, right? And now we say, no, it actually makes kids smarter. But I also don't like to put so much pressure on, bilingualism that it has to make kids smarter. And there's some mixed evidence on this, right? A lot of it depends on kind of what we mean by smarter. So here's what there's evidence for. There's some evidence that bilingualism has advantages for something called self-regulation. Oh, there's a typo here, I'm sorry. So here, the ability to control our impulses. The idea is that when you speak two languages and you have to keep two languages kind of in mind all the time, you have to suppress one of the languages, so that you're not using it all the time. And that practice and kind of doing that can also help kids to learn to control some impulses. I will say the research, the evidence on this is a little mixed. Some studies suggest there's some evidence for it. Some studies don't find evidence of this. So I want to be cautious in saying, but it's kind of an intriguing idea. And maybe over time, we'll get a clearer picture. Another one is perspective taking. So if you're bilingual, you speak a language that other people don't speak. You kind of, kids have to kind of early on start to understand that, that person doesn't understand me when I speak this language, right? We're not the same. And that makes kids have to take the other person's perspective, right? To sort of take the perspective that they're not going to understand them if they speak in another language. And so that practice seems to help kids develop a sort of better perspective taking of other people and tolerance. But I think most important is that bilingualism has advantages for family relations and kids' identity and identity development, especially as they get older. Kids, who sort of maintain their home languages can feel more secure in their identities and in their kind of maintain relations with family members that can be really important. And there are some professional advantages as well. And then let me talk about the media. I think I have, oh no, sorry. Okay, I thought I had put it here at the end and it looks like I didn't. So let me just answer your question about media. So early on, for kids kind of younger than 3, media is not helpful for learning language. It like electronic media, at least electronic media that's just kind of like TV, like shows. I don't have time to tell you about all the research, but I'm happy to send some papers if people are interested in. But basically, they did the study, right, where they exposed kids to another language by a live person and by TV. And the kids who were exposed with a live person were able to maintain their, knowledge of that second language, and the kids who heard it on TV were not. These are for young kids. But once kids are older, and part of that is that very young kids don't know anything about language. And so in order to learn, they need a lot of social support. Like I said, they need the social support. They need someone who is paying attention to what they're doing, what they're paying attention to, what they're looking at, and like that. And TVs don't do that. But once they're older, they can learn from TV. So just wait until your kid is kind of older. And at that point, you can provide some exposure with media. I hope that answered. Okay, and there's one question here in the chat. Let me read it. So not a native Spanish speaker, but spend all day with my son, so I get more time with him than my husband, who is a native speaker. Will my proficient but not quite fluent Spanish be bad for my son to hear? Oh yeah, this is a great question. I strive speaking both languages so that he hears Spanish more. Okay, let me answer that question. So this is, I'm glad you asked this question, Brielle. So no, your Spanish will not be bad for your son to hear. It will not be bad for your son to hear. There is actually a recent study on this that is really nice to see. There's no evidence that it will be harmful. It might not be as helpful as your husband's Spanish, right? So a native speaker, so that's why I say, you know, if you want to speak in the language you feel more comfortable in, there are some, you know, that will, you know, if you feel more comfortable and you kind of use more and more diverse and more complex, but it will absolutely not be bad, and it will be beneficial, just not as beneficial as that of a more fluent native speaker. And then good language resources for toddlers. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that is, you know, that's a great question. I, you know, would sort of add to the question in the chat that it would, you know, it would be great if this is something that maybe the library can, you know, it looks like there's, yeah, it looks like it's something that parents want and something that Leanne is on your radar. So that sounds wonderful. There are now more, something we've been sort of paying attention to, there are more children's books in Spanish than there used to be, and bilingual books. So I can try to send some of those resources, and some, here's one that you might look at. There's something called Un, Dos, Tres, Andrés. There is something called Little Libros. There's something called Canticos. And there are, you know, some others sometimes I find on YouTube videos, reading in Spanish, but I know we need more.
Thank you.
All right, let me stop sharing my screen, and I'm gonna have to go because I have to pick up to get my my little one. But any final thoughts or questions?
I just want to say I found this discussion this evening for the past hour extremely enlightening, and I want to thank you very much for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for joining and for your questions and your thoughts. And thank you, Leanne, for inviting me.
Thank you for hosting this wonderful program. It has been so insightful.
I'm so glad. Okay. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, and take care.
You too.